For years, the story of Summer Wells has been told in fragments, whispers, suspicions, and half-truths. But now, those scattered pieces are beginning to align. A mother's admission of being under investigation, a neighbor's chilling account of children being drugged, and a father's claim that his daughter would never be found. These are no longer just rumors. When set against the exact moment CPS stepped in, and the unexplored stretch of road between Beech Creek and Dawn's worksite, they point toward a timeline that can finally be tested. This isn't about revisiting old theories, it's about closing the gap. And if that alignment holds, it may be the first real step toward revealing what happened to Summer Wells. The first spark that jolts this story out of rumor and into the realm of terrifying possibility begins with a sentence Candus Bly herself allegedly spoke to a former friend, someone who once shared her trust but later turned away. Candace confessed that she and Dawn were under investigation for SA. At first glance, it may sound like another line in the endless cycle of gossip that has surrounded this family, but the weight of those words is different. They are not accusations whispered online, not speculative commentary from outsiders. They are the mother's own words, attributed directly to her in a private conversation. And that forces us to confront a question that changes the entire framework of this case. Why would she say it? The circumstances make the statement even more unnerving. It wasn't said in the glare of television lights or in response to probing by detectives. It was reportedly uttered in private, after Summer had already vanished, when emotions were high and stress was unbearable. Candace did not stand in a courtroom. She did not sign an affidavit. She spoke to someone she believed she could confide in. But that person is no longer a friend, and the bond that once shielded her words has shattered. What remains is an alleged confession hanging in the air, its credibility fragile, yet impossible to ignore. If she fabricated it, why choose such a damning charge? Why not claim she was under investigation for neglect, or for being careless, or for something far less destructive than sexual assault? To reach immediately for SA suggests the specter was already real in her world, lurking in conversations she could no longer keep hidden. Investigators and psychologists know that stress often cracks a person's defenses. When people feel cornered, they sometimes blurt out statements that reveal more than they intend. Spontaneous admissions, even when not legally binding, often prove to be closer to the truth than carefully rehearsed denials. If Candace truly believed she and Dawn were under investigation, then the possibility cannot be dismissed as casual gossip. Such investigations are not invented out of thin air. They emerge when agencies see enough smoke to suspect fire. On the other hand, the words might have been her attempt to dramatize her situation, to claim persecution and gather sympathy by presenting herself as a target of wild accusations. That duality, the possibility of confession or the tactic of manipulation, defines the mystery of her statement. The chilling part is that this alleged confession does not exist in isolation. Tennessee's Department of Children's Services, the state's child protection agency, did have a file on the Wells family. This is not speculation but fact. Concerns about neglect had been documented, and the family was already under scrutiny. In June 2025, Dawn and Candace publicly celebrated when the case was dismissed, a judge ruling that the allegations neglect were unsubstantiated. At face value, this cleared their names. But in legal reality, dismissal does not mean innocence. It means that the evidence collected was not strong enough to meet the burden of proof. In child protection cases, that bar can be higher than the public imagines. Witnesses recant, documentation is thin, and courts often err on the side of caution when evidence is circumstantial. A closed file is not the same as a clean slate. This is why Candace's words echo with such menace. When she told her friend that she and Dawn were under investigation for SA, she was not inventing a world that did not exist. She was drawing from an environment where her household was already being watched, where authorities had already stepped close enough to open a case. Her private admission may not align with the exact terminology of the file, but it resonates with the reality that her family was, indeed, under suspicion. Skeptics will point out, fairly, that the only account of this confession comes from someone no longer loyal to Candace. The testimony is hearsay, unverified, and unsupported by audio or video. In a courtroom, it would never survive. But credibility does not operate in a vacuum. When such a statement aligns with broader patterns, Dawn's criminal history, erratic behavior in interviews, other allegations from family members, and the verified existence of CPS involvement, it becomes harder to brush aside. Even if the source is compromised, the content of the claim feels plausible because it fits too neatly with everything else we already know. The psychological implications run deeper still. Imagine yourself in Candace's position. Under the glare of suspicion, the pressure of losing your daughter, and the scrutiny of both media and investigators. In that pressure cooker, why reach for the phrase, "under investigation for Psy"? If she intended to exaggerate or invent her plight, safer choices existed: neglect, banned substances use, unfair targeting. To leap straight to sexual assault is to open a wound most people would never dare touch unless it was already raw. This makes the statement far less likely to be a random invention, and far more likely to be a reflection of real fears or real knowledge. The larger picture this creates is disturbing. Most missing child cases, at least at first, focus on an external predator, a stranger lurking, an abductor from outside. That narrative is easier to digest, and for parents, it is less damning. But Candace's own words redirect the lens inward. If her household was under investigation, if SA was the cloud hanging over their heads, then Summer's disappearance may not be an isolated event. It may have been the tragic endpoint of a much longer story, one in which the warning signs had already been recorded. Taken alone, the statement remains fragile, open to challenge and dismissal. But woven into the fabric of the Wells family's history, it becomes a thread that tightens the entire tapestry. It is not the smoking gun that solves the case, but it is the alarm bell that tells us we are looking in the right place. Whether it was a slip of the tongue, a defensive exaggeration, or an accidental admission, Candus Bly's alleged confession carries a weight that no amount of denial can erase. And if those words truly reflected what was happening behind closed doors, then they are not simply echoes of a frightened mother, they are the first signal of a truth that investigators may yet be able to prove. The question now is whether other voices, like that of Summer's Aunt Mary, will confirm the shadow Candace revealed, or whether they will open the door to an even darker reality waiting just below the surface. When the disappearance of a child becomes a national obsession, voices rise from every direction: neighbors, former friends, strangers on the internet. But the voice that matters most is the one that comes from inside the family itself. In the case of Summer Wells, that voice belonged to Mary, Summer's aunt, who stepped forward with claims that were as disturbing as they were difficult to dismiss. She was not a neighbor speculating from across the road. She was not a passerby trying to insert herself into the spotlight. She was family, and that fact alone gives her allegations a weight that cannot be ignored. Mary's relationship to the Wells family positioned her in a way outsiders never could be. She knew Dawn not as a stranger, but as blood. She understood the rhythms of the household, the patterns of behavior, and the family secrets whispered behind closed doors. In family dynamics, trust is complicated. Love and resentment often intertwine. But when someone close to you accuses you of sexual, the claim strikes deeper than mere gossip. It hints at a history dark enough to fracture the bonds of kinship itself. Her allegations were clear. Don Wells, Summer's father, had engaged in inappropriate sexual behavior in the past. Mary spoke of incidents that went back decades, stories of within the family that she claimed were covered up or ignored. Some accounts pointed to behavior when Dawn was younger, possibly as a teenager, involving family members who were vulnerable. She painted a portrait not of a man who suddenly snapped in 2021, but of someone whose shadow had stretched across multiple generations. The details, though painful, matter. Mary described Dawn as someone who had crossed boundaries long before Summer was ever born. She spoke of sexual misconduct toward siblings, of situations where trust was violated at its most intimate level. While these accounts lacked the kind of physical evidence that would hold up in a courtroom, they were not vague accusations thrown at random. They were specific, rooted in the memory of lived experience, and they came from someone who knew the family's internal history. What makes Mary's testimony particularly unsettling is how it aligns with the narrative already emerging from Candace's own alleged confession. If Candace told her friend that she and Dawn were under investigation for SA, and Mary independently accused Dawn of sexual in the past, the stories intersect. They come from different angles, one a present-day slip of the tongue, the other a recollection of past trauma, but together they form a line pointing to the same conclusion. Don Wells carried with him a history of sexual suspicion. Psychologists often note that patterns of behavior, especially those involving sexual misconduct, rarely occur in isolation. Someone who crosses boundaries once is more likely to cross them again. If Mary's allegations about Dawn's past are true, they suggest not just a single act but a trajectory. They imply a man who has lived for years with impulses unchecked, someone whose capacity for violating trust may have continued into his role as a father. In that context, Summer's disappearance becomes less a mystery of an outside predator and more the grim culmination of patterns seeded long before she was born. Of course, credibility must always be tested. Families are complicated, and estranged relatives sometimes harbor resentment strong enough to twist the truth. Did Mary have reason to despise Dawn beyond the allegations? Was there bad blood between them, disputes over property, money, or grudges that had festered for years? It is possible. In the crucible of family feuds, accusations can become weapons, sharpened not by truth but by vengeance. Skeptics will argue that Mary's timing, stepping forward during the height of the investigation, was opportunistic. They may see her as someone seeking attention, amplifying the drama around an already sensational case. But even skepticism has limits. Mary never wavered in her claims. She did not recant. She did not adjust her story to suit the headlines. Her words remained consistent, anchored in the same disturbing allegations each time she spoke. If this were simply an act of malice, one might expect inconsistencies, embellishments, or eventual retreat. Instead, what we see is a steady voice insisting that Dawn's past was not as innocent as it appeared. Public records do not reveal any official charges of sexual against Dawn from earlier in his life. No court documents exist to prove Mary's claims. That absence is frustrating, but it does not erase the possibility that they occurred. In many families, such crimes are buried, shielded by shame and silence. Victims often fear speaking out, especially when the accused is a relative with power in the household. It is not uncommon for these stories to surface decades later, when the climate feels safer and when a new event, such as the disappearance of a child, forces the truth into the open. What we do know is that Dawn's documented criminal history paints the picture of a troubled man. Reports show arrests involving banned substances, weapons, and even domestic incidents. He was once caught driving under the influence while possessing a firearm, a combination that underscores recklessness and disregard for law. There are also accounts of violent behavior, the kind that suggests a volatile temperament. While these are not proof of sexual misconduct, they support the narrative of a man with a history of destructive choices. When viewed alongside Mary's testimony, they add credibility to the idea that Dawn has long lived outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior. This is why Mary's voice matters so much. She is not a random commentator trying to guess what happened to Summer. She is someone from inside the circle, someone who knew the family history and carried the weight of that knowledge for years. Her willingness to speak publicly, despite the backlash and skepticism, signals that she believed her words could prevent the truth from being buried once again. If her allegations are true, they are not just a condemnation of Dawn Wells as an individual. They are an indictment of a system that failed to act earlier. They suggest that warning signs were present, that family secrets were whispered, and that authorities either ignored them or never had the chance to investigate properly. In that light, Summer's disappearance may not have been an unforeseeable tragedy, but the predictable outcome of a long. Even if one chooses to doubt Mary's motives, the alignment of her claims with Candace's alleged confession is too striking to ignore. Two voices, from two different points in time, painting a picture of a man entangled in allegations of sexual. When added to the documented fact that Child Protective Services were already monitoring the household, the case against Dawn strengthens. It does not convict him in a court of law, but it builds a narrative where guilt feels far less improbable. The significance of Mary's role cannot be overstated. She represents the painful truth that sometimes the most damning evidence comes not from DNA or forensic trails, but from those who lived closest to the accused. Family testimonies can be messy, but they often reveal the reality behind closed doors. Mary's allegations may not have led to charges, but they changed the way the world looks at Dawn Wells. They shifted suspicion inward, reinforcing the notion that the darkness surrounding Summer's disappearance may have originated within the walls of her own home. Whether Dawn's past was filled with unspeakable acts, or whether Mary exaggerated out of bitterness, one thing remains certain: her testimony is a piece of the puzzle. It is a reminder that the search for truth is not only about what happened the day Summer disappeared, but about the history that led there. In the case of Summer Wells, one of those voices was Jodie Sue, a neighbor who lived just down the road from 110 Ben Hill, close enough to watch comings and goings, close enough to sense that what was happening on that property was not entirely ordinary. Her words have lingered in the shadows of this case, whispered through online discussions and forums, rarely captured by mainstream outlets, yet persistent enough to shape the narrative of what might have unfolded behind the Wells walls. Jodie Sue described a scenario that feels like something pulled from the darkest corners of true crime history. She claimed that children were being given banned substances designed not to harm them immediately, but to sedate them, to leave them helpless, unable to resist or even comprehend what was happening. It is not merely the idea of neglect or of reckless parenting under the influence of substances, but of something more intentional, a system where children were rendered unconscious so that they could be touched, manipulated without resistance. Her allegations were blunt and deeply unsettling. This wasn't about a family drinking too much, or about occasional fights spilling out into the yard. It was about the use of banned substances on minors, a deliberate, organized act. While Jodie Sue never identified a specific substance, the insinuation is clear. Whether slipped into food or drink, whether inhaled through smoke that hung in the air, or delivered in another form, the picture she painted was one of children lulled into silence not by bedtime stories, but by chemicals. That claim alone, if proven, would reframe everything about Summer's disappearance. The internet quickly became a megaphone for Jodie Sue's statements. Reddit threads, blogs, and amateur sleuth forums picked up her words and repeated them endlessly, citing her as the neighbor who knew too much, the woman who had seen or heard what others were too afraid to say. The details shifted slightly depending on who was telling the story. Sometimes the emphasis was on banned substances used inside the house, other times on the idea that girls specifically were being targeted and sedated, but the core allegation remained intact. In the absence of a mainstream report that pinned her down with quotes, her testimony has lived in a twilight zone, not officially debunked, but not officially confirmed either. That in-between status is important. It leaves us asking whether her perspective was shaped by direct observation, or by rumor overheard, or even by her own conflicts with the Wells family. Neighbors in rural areas often carry grudges that last decades. Boundary disputes, noise, dogs on the wrong property, small issues that fester into resentments. Did Jodie Sue have such motives? Or did she, in fact, glimpse something she could never unsee? The truth may lie somewhere in the middle. Perhaps she observed enough to form suspicions, and those suspicions hardened into certainty when filtered through her own fears and biases. Yet even suspicion deserves attention when it aligns with other troubling strands. Consider the overlap. Candace allegedly told a friend that she and Dawn were under investigation for SA. Mary, Summer's aunt, claimed Dawn had a past of sexual within the family. Jodie Sue, from her position as neighbor, layered on the claim that children were drugged for precisely that purpose. 3 different sources, with 3 different vantage points, all pointing toward the same grotesque possibility that the threat to Summer did not come from a stranger outside the home, but from within her own environment. If children are actually given sleeping pills, that would explain details that have puzzled investigators and the public from the beginning. Why were there no screams, no clear evidence of a struggle? Why did the disappearance seem to happen so quietly, so quickly? A child drugged into unconsciousness would not cry out. They would not resist being carried. They would leave behind no obvious signs of panic, only silence. And silence has been the theme of this case from the start. The problem, of course, is that allegations are not evidence. Without a toxicology report, without seized substances or medical examinations, Jodie Sue's words remain what they are, testimony, colored by her position and her perception. Law enforcement has not released any official confirmation that such an allegation was ever substantiated. No search warrants made public have listed banned substances used to sedate minors. But absence of proof is not proof of absence. In crimes like these, especially in rural areas where oversight is thin, such practices could occur undetected for years. Even without a signed police report to validate her claims, the mere existence of her voice matters. It adds pressure. It adds context. And it adds plausibility to the broader theory that Summer's disappearance was not the result of a single spontaneous event, but of an environment where it was normalized, where control of children extended to the most invasive and chemical of methods. If verified, Jodie Sue's allegations would escalate the case from a missing persons mystery into something far darker, an organized pattern of child, facilitated and concealed by banned substances. It would mean that Summer's disappearance was not only foreseeable, but inevitable, the outcome of a home already steeped in cycles of predation. For investigators, it would also mean they had overlooked a key opportunity, failing to act on warning signs that, if true, were being spoken about in the community even before the little girl vanished. That is why her voice cannot be dismissed. In a case already marred by silence, by conflicting statements, and by inconclusive searches, the allegations of a neighbor may not convict anyone. But they force us to re-examine the Wells household with sharper eyes. As we move deeper into the story, Jodie Sue's account serves as another piece of the puzzle, one that fits disturbingly well with the accusations of Mary and the admission attributed to Candace. And if that portrait is accurate, then Summer's silence was not just the silence of a child who disappeared, but of a child who may have been rendered voiceless long before the world noticed she was gone. In every state, there is an agency designed to protect children when ordinary safeguards fail. In Tennessee, that responsibility belongs to the Department of Children's Services, known as DCS. Their mandate is wide. They can investigate homes, remove children from unsafe environments, and petition courts to restrict or even terminate parental rights. They are not simply a welfare office. They are a branch of government with the authority to step in when a child's safety is in doubt. The Wells family was no stranger to this oversight. Records confirm that DCS had opened a file on the household before Summer disappeared. What began as a review of the family's living conditions and parenting decisions evolved into an active case. According to a report shared publicly in June 2025, Don and Candace themselves acknowledged the existence of this file. They later celebrated its closure when a judge ruled that all opinions of neglect had been dropped and unsubstantiated. On paper, the case was erased. Rumors spread quickly in the aftermath of Summer's disappearance. Neighbors whispered that DCS had been planning to visit the property in the days leading up to June 15, 2021. Online forums speculated that the timing of the intervention and the sudden vanishing of a child were not coincidence, but cause and effect. Could it be that the looming presence of child welfare officials created panic inside the home? Could Summer's disappearance have been, in part, a desperate attempt to redirect or delay scrutiny? These questions do not come from thin air. They are fueled by the known reality that oversight was already underway. The timing is everything. If a family senses that intervention is imminent, they may react unpredictably. In some cases, children are hidden with relatives, moved to new addresses, or kept out of sight to prevent removal. In more troubling cases, a child can disappear altogether, leaving investigators with nothing but speculation. The absence of a child in the midst of an active DCS file is more than coincidence. It is a storm of red flags converging at the same moment. What followed only deepened suspicion. After Summer was reported missing, DCS returned with forceful measures. The 3 remaining Wells boys were removed from the home. This was not a casual decision. Removing children from their parents is one of the most extreme steps DCS can take, and it requires compelling justification. Officials do not uproot minors from their families unless they believe the risk of leaving them is greater than the trauma of separation. By taking the boys, the agency signaled that their concerns about the Wells household were severe and urgent. That decision changes how we interpret everything that came before. If DCS found enough evidence to justify removing 3 children after Summer vanished, what does that say about the state of the home while she was still there? Was her disappearance the tipping point, the moment that transformed suspicions into immediate action? Or was it the very reason the agency felt compelled to move swiftly? Fearing that what had happened to one child might happen again, critics of DCS raise an important counterpoint: the eventual dismissal of the Wells case. In June 2025, a judge ruled that the findings could not stand, and the record was formally closed. Supporters of Dawn and Candace point to that ruling as proof of their innocence, insisting that no wrongdoing was ever proven. But dismissals can result from many factors: lack of hard evidence, procedural errors, or even the reluctance of witnesses to testify. None of those outcomes prove that the original concerns were baseless. They prove only that the case, in its final form, could not survive the scrutiny of court. The fact that DCS once had an active file on the family is not up for debate. The fact that their sons were removed is also not in dispute. The question is what those actions reveal about the days and hours before Summer disappeared. If the timing was as close as many believe, the possibility arises that her disappearance was not random at all, but connected directly to the pressure of oversight. If a child welfare worker was preparing to step onto Ben Hill Road, the family may have felt cornered. And when people feel cornered, they sometimes make irreversible decisions. Whether DCS could have acted sooner is a haunting question. Had the agency intervened 1 week earlier, would Summer still be alive? Had they delayed another week, would the outcome have been the same? In hindsight, the overlap between their investigation and her disappearance feels like more than coincidence. It feels like a warning sign that was flashing too late to prevent what happened. And so, the involvement of DCS is not just a footnote in this story. It is central. It transforms the case from a mystery without context into a tragedy framed by systemic scrutiny. Summer did not vanish from a home free of suspicion. She vanished from a home already under the eye of child protection officials. That reality alone reshapes the way investigators, journalists, and the public view the timeline. The removal of her brothers was a signal that whatever was happening inside that home was not safe enough for children to remain. The eventual dismissal of the case may clear legal liability, but it cannot erase the urgency of those actions in real time. At the moment Summer disappeared, the Wells family was not just another household. They were a household under investigation, a household on the verge of intervention. From this vantage point, the path forward becomes clearer. To understand what happened to Summer, one must not only study the day she went missing, but the weeks and months leading up to it, when oversight grew stronger and pressure mounted. Her disappearance cannot be separated from that context. It may, in fact, be the key to explaining why she vanished at all. One of the most haunting questions in the disappearance of Summer Wells is not simply what happened to her, but where. Geography matters in any investigation, and the landscape surrounding 110 Ben Hill Road offers a labyrinth of possibilities. The Wells home sits off Beech Creek Road, a rural stretch lined with thick woods, dirt paths, and steep hollows that seem to swallow sound and sight. The terrain itself becomes a suspect, dense enough to conceal movement, winding enough to lose a trail, and secluded enough to keep secrets for years. From that home, Don Wells traveled daily to his construction job, a route that cut across back roads and forested stretches. The distance between Beech Creek and his worksite was not great in absolute miles, but long enough to offer countless places where a person could stop without drawing attention. Hidden clearings, service roads, abandoned sheds, and narrow bridges dotted the way. In rural Tennessee, a driver can pull over and vanish from view within seconds, shielded by undergrowth or by the curve of a hill. Investigators studying this case have long considered whether Don's commute could also have been a corridor for something darker than routine labor. The theory is simple but chilling. Some believe Dawn may have returned home the afternoon Summer vanished, either briefly leaving work or arriving earlier than expected. From there, he could have taken Summer with him on the road back out, presenting the image of normalcy to anyone watching. What happened next, according to this scenario, is that she never came back. Along the drive, there are endless opportunities to stop, to step out, to leave something behind. A child could be carried off the road into the woods, left in a shallow hollow, or hidden beneath discarded debris. If not hidden in the forest, she could have been taken closer to his job site, left in a place far from Beech Creek, where no one would think to search. Support for this theory comes not only from speculation, but from fragments of reported evidence. Early search efforts with tracking dogs picked up Summer's scent, tracing it down into the woods near the Wells property. But then, the trail abruptly ended at a roadway. That sudden cutoff has always been suspicious. It suggests that her scent did not fade away naturally, but was interrupted, as if she was lifted into a vehicle, carried beyond the reach of the dogs' noses. This aligns with the idea of her being transported rather than wandering off. Adding to the suspicion is a lingering detail that circulated widely online. A red Toyota Tacoma pickup truck reportedly spotted near the area on the day of her disappearance. Law enforcement at one point appealed to the public for information about this vehicle, describing it as a potential lead. Some community members believed the truck could have been used in the transportation of Summer. While no definitive link was ever proven, the image of a red pickup became another thread in the theory that her disappearance was tied to a vehicle and a road, not the woods immediately around her home. Law enforcement themselves never fully confirmed the exact route Dawn traveled that day. Hundreds of tips were collected, thousands of leads investigated, but no single map was drawn that connected Dawn's movements with Summer's disappearance. Investigators interviewed neighbors, co-workers, and family members, yet the trail remained as elusive as the child herself. What remains are pieces: a cut-off scent trail, a suspicious truck, and a rural highway that could hide 1,000 secrets. The vulnerabilities of this theory are real. If Summer's body had been moved along that route, nature itself may have destroyed the evidence. Rain washes away scent and soil disturbance. Wildlife scatters remains. Leaves fall and cover shallow ground. Over time, what might have been a clear sign becomes indistinguishable from the forest floor. And if an accomplice were involved, someone who provided tools, transportation, or even simply stood lookout, then the act could have been carried out with even greater efficiency, leaving fewer traces behind. Investigators face the risk that by focusing on one direction of travel, they may have missed hidden side roads, paths, and hollows that branch off into dead ends and private clearings. In this terrain, the difference between searching one hollow and the next could mean missing everything. Still, the plausibility of the Beech Creek to Worksite theory cannot be dismissed. Dawn knew these roads well. He drove them daily. He knew which corners were blind, which turnouts were rarely used, and which trails could lead into the woods without ever being noticed. He had both the familiarity and the opportunity, and in cases like this, familiarity often proves decisive. The weight of this theory also lies in a haunting remark from investigators themselves. At one point, a law enforcement officer suggested that if Summer were ever found, it would likely be close by. That phrase has lingered in the minds of many following the case. What did close by mean? Within a mile of her home, within the valley of Beech Creek, or within the daily orbit of Dawn's routine? The path from home to work. If officials believed she was not far, then their focus may have already been aligned with the idea that her disappearance was tied to the geography of her father's movements. In the end, the Beech Creek to Worksite hypothesis remains unproven, but it is one of the most coherent maps available. It takes into account the geography, the incomplete scent trail, the suspicious vehicle, and the practical knowledge Dawn had of his surroundings. It acknowledges the possibility of stops along the way, of hidden locations where the truth might still rest. It does not convict, but it compels. And if, someday, a fragment is uncovered along that corridor, an item of clothing, a remnant overlooked, a trace preserved despite time, It could transform speculation into certainty. For now, the road remains both a literal and metaphorical path, one that could lead investigators closer to the truth, or one that keeps winding into silence. Among all the words spoken in the aftermath of Summer Wells' disappearance, one sentence stands apart, chilling in both tone and implication. Dawn Wells, in a recorded interview, said plainly, "She will never be found." It was not shouted in anger or whispered in secrecy. It was spoken aloud, captured for the public, a declaration that has since echoed across every discussion of the case. The question is, what did he mean? Was this a threat, a grim prediction, or a slip of the tongue that revealed more than he intended? The timing of this remark is crucial. Dawn made it not in the first frantic hours of searching, but after days had passed, when investigators were already combing through the property and surrounding woods. By then, he had spoken to reporters multiple times. He was not an unguarded man surprised by a microphone. He was an interview subject who had been quoted repeatedly. And yet, even with that awareness, he chose words that sounded less like the anguish of a desperate father and more like the certainty of someone who already knew the outcome. Criminal psychology offers a lens for understanding language in high-pressure situations. Offenders often reveal themselves not through confessions, but through slips, statements that unconsciously expose what they are trying to conceal. "She will never be found" can be heard in several ways. One interpretation is that of intimidation, a verbal warning aimed at others who might know more. Another is the voice of confidence, suggesting he believed the act had been concealed so thoroughly that discovery was impossible. A third possibility is despair, the resignation of someone who had lost hope and was speaking out of raw emotion rather than calculation. What makes the line so haunting is how it resembles statements made in other notorious cases. In multiple investigations, suspects have tried to create distance by declaring that a victim was gone forever, or that nobody will ever find them. Time and again, such declarations were later revisited as evidence of hidden knowledge. When people speak with certainty about an uncertain outcome, investigators take notice. Parents of missing children typically hold to hope, clinging to the possibility of return. Certainty of loss, especially framed in absolutes like "never," stands out. Placed against the backdrop of other testimonies in this case, Dawn's words gain even more weight. Candace reportedly told a friend that she and Dawn were under investigation. Mary accused Dawn of disturbing conduct in the past. Neighbor Jodie Sue described children being rendered silent under suspicious circumstances. Alone, each piece raises questions together. They form a pattern in which Dawn's statement becomes less like an isolated remark and more like another link in a chain of suspicion. If Candace was hinting at oversight, if Mary was recalling past misconduct, if Jodie Sue was speaking of children subdued, then Dawn's declaration that Summer would never be found reads almost like the final chapter to a story already written. Yet, fairness demands caution. Remarks in interviews are often clipped, misquoted, or presented without full context. Dawn might have been echoing what he felt investigators were implying, that the landscape was too vast, the terrain too unforgiving, to guarantee a discovery. He might have been speaking not from knowledge but from fear, trying to steel himself for a grim possibility. Without the full transcript and tone of the conversation, there remains the chance that his words have been amplified or misinterpreted. Even so, the impact of that single sentence cannot be overstated. For the online community following the case, it became a symbol. Clips of Dawn saying, "never be found," were replayed, dissected, and shared. The phrase crystallized into a shorthand for guilt, a banner under which theories were built. Whether or not he meant it as a factual statement, it carried the weight of finality. Ultimately, Dawn's statement is not proof of action, but it is a mirror reflecting his state of mind. For some, it is the voice of a father broken by despair. For others, it is the voice of a man who knew more than he should. The truth lies in the interpretation, and interpretation is all investigators have until physical evidence emerges. If future discoveries confirm foul play, this sentence will not be remembered as speculation, it will be remembered as foreshadowing. As we move deeper, the next question must be asked. If Dawn's certainty was rooted in knowledge, Does that point toward concealment? Or does it suggest something else? That Summer was not lost forever, but handed off in secrecy, beyond the reach of both family and law enforcement. That possibility, the theory of a hidden transfer rather than death, is where the story now turns. Not every theory about Summer Wells ends with the conclusion that her life ended the day she vanished. Among the darker scenarios that investigators and online communities have considered is the possibility that she was not harmed immediately at all, but rather handed off, deliberately removed from her home and placed in the custody of someone else. This hidden transfer theory does not erase the tragedy, but it shifts the nature of the event from an instant loss to a concealed relocation. The premise is simple but unsettling. Instead of facing questions from authorities or risking intervention from child welfare services, someone in the household could have chosen to move Summer elsewhere. She might have been given to a friend, a distant relative, or even to strangers in an arrangement designed to keep her hidden. The motivations for such a move could vary: fear of losing her to the state, panic about existing investigations, or a belief that she would be safer away from home. Some versions of the theory go even further, suggesting that financial desperation could have played a role, pointing to whispered claims that Dawn had once given away a child before, only to bring them back later. If true, that anecdote provides a disturbing precedent. What makes this theory attractive to some is its ability to explain the greatest mystery in the case: the absence of physical evidence. No remains, no confirmed traces, no definitive signs of a struggle. If Summer had been killed near the home, searchers expected to find something: a scent trail that lasted longer, disturbed soil, discarded belongings. Instead, investigators were left with silence. A secret transfer, carried out with planning, could explain why nothing was found. Still, for all its plausibility on paper, the hidden transfer theory faces enormous challenges in practice. To hide a 5-year-old child indefinitely is no small task, especially in an age of digital footprints, school enrollment requirements, medical records, and surveillance technology. Any caretaker would have to ensure she never appeared on social media, never visited a doctor under her real name, and never entered a school system where routine paperwork could expose her identity. Even informal arrangements within extended families often unravel under pressure as children grow older and begin asking questions or confiding in others. The logistics also raise serious obstacles. Moving a child in secrecy requires transport and potentially documents if the movement extended across state lines or national borders. In theory, such a relocation could be hidden in rural networks where informal guardianship arrangements sometimes escape notice. But over years, the risk of discovery multiplies. One photograph, one casual remark, or one slip in paperwork could unravel the entire scheme. For this reason, many seasoned investigators view permanent concealment as far less likely than immediate harm. Nevertheless, there are precedents where children have been transferred, sometimes within organized networks. In certain high-profile cases, minors were passed to others in covert arrangements that lasted months or even years. But those situations almost always left behind traces: phone calls intercepted, financial records flagged, or witnesses who later came forward. What distinguishes Summer's case is the complete absence of such leaks. If she was indeed given away, then whoever received her has maintained a silence that is remarkable in its endurance. For investigators considering this angle, the logical starting points would be financial and social. Were there unusual cash withdrawals, sudden debt repayments, or unexplained purchases around the time of her disappearance? Did the Wells family maintain contact with anyone who could plausibly take in a child? Were there gaps in local oversight, charitable organizations, unregulated caregivers, or unofficial foster arrangements that might have served as conduits? Any anomaly, no matter how small, could provide the thread that unravels a transfer. Community members have long debated whether Dawn's remark that Summer would never be found fits this scenario. Some interpret it as evidence of a concealed body. Others see it as consistent with the transfer theory, an acknowledgement that she is alive, but hidden, beyond the reach of law enforcement or the public. If this reading holds, his words could be less about death and more about permanent concealment. In the end, the hidden transfer theory occupies a gray space. It is less gruesome than some alternatives, but no less disturbing, because it suggests deliberate concealment carried out with planning and intent. It is weighed down by practical impossibilities, yet buoyed by the fact that no remains have ever been located. Without discovery, certainty is impossible, but absence of evidence keeps the door ajar. For now, investigators and the public must hold this possibility alongside others, neither fully embraced nor fully dismissed. As long as Summer's whereabouts remain unknown, theories of relocation cannot be excluded. And if, against the odds, she was handed off rather than lost on that June day, then the truth may still exist in the shadows of someone's silence. When a child disappears, hope lingers on the possibility of rescue. But as years pass, the grim focus of investigators inevitably shifts from search to recovery, from the dream of reunion to the possibility of uncovering remains. For Summer Wells, if human remains are one day discovered in the hills or creeks around Beech Creek, the question will not simply be where she was found, but whether her discovery can finally lead to justice. Forensic science is powerful, but it is also bound by the limitations of time and environment. In the wooded valleys of Tennessee, a body left exposed to the elements undergoes rapid transformation. Within weeks, decomposition can strip away crucial evidence. Rain, humidity, and wildlife all conspire to erase the marks of violence. A shallow burial delays but does not prevent these processes, and water accelerates them further, scattering tissue and diluting traces. Even in the best conditions, identifying the precise cause of death becomes more difficult with each passing month. In Summer's case, years have already slipped away, increasing the likelihood that only skeletal remains would remain. From a legal perspective, that presents formidable challenges. To secure a conviction, prosecutors do not need to prove innocence or guilt in the abstract. They must persuade a jury that the evidence points to one conclusion beyond reasonable doubt. For a homicide case, that generally requires establishing two pillars. First, that a crime took place, and second, that the accused can be tied directly to it. Without both, trials collapse. Proving a crime requires more than showing a child is deceased. Investigators must demonstrate how it happened, whether through violent force, suffocation, drowning, or another fatal act. When soft tissue is long gone, that proof must be sought in the bones, fractures, cut marks, or blunt trauma etched into the skeleton. But even then, not all injuries leave permanent traces. Strangulation, for example, often leaves no skeletal sign, especially in a child. Without a clear pattern, the defense can argue that death resulted from an accident or from circumstances that cannot be proven criminal. The second pillar, linking the suspect, demands physical evidence that places them in contact with the remains. That might include DNA under fingernails, impressions of footwear in surrounding soil, fibers embedded in clothing, or residues from tools that match those owned by the accused. But such links are fragile. Exposure to weather degrades DNA, clothing fades and rots, fibers disintegrate. Even when items survive, defense attorneys can argue that transfer occurred in ordinary family life rather than during a crime. For example, if Dawn or Candace's DNA is found on Summer's clothing, that proves little on its own, since they lived together. Prosecutors need something more distinctive: blood traces that do not match innocent contact, or tool marks that directly connect to equipment in the family's possession. The complications are amplified if the body was ever moved. Relocation scatters the timeline, mixing soils and confusing insect activity that might otherwise help determine when death occurred. If remains were partially burned, the heat could erase both DNA and bone detail. If heavy equipment was used to crush or conceal the body, fractures might be indistinguishable from post-mortem damage. Each of these variables erodes the clarity of the evidence, providing the defense with avenues to sow doubt. There are, however, scenarios where even long-delayed discoveries can be decisive. If skeletal remains show sharp cuts consistent with a blade, or fractures clearly caused by deliberate force, those patterns can point strongly to foul play. If personal items, clothing, toys, or jewelry recognizable as Summer's are found in the same location, they anchor the identity of the remains and strengthen the chain of evidence. Even fragments of duct tape, rope, or plastic sheeting can provide forensic traces linking back to suspects. In other cases, soil samples beneath a burial have preserved bodily fluids long after other tissues were gone, providing DNA that withstood years underground. The gold standard for prosecutors would be a combination: skeletal injuries showing violence, personal items belonging to Summer, and foreign DNA or trace evidence linking a suspect directly to the site. That kind of trifecta can transform speculation into proof. But absent one of those elements, the prosecution's case weakens dramatically. This tension between what is required and what is available defines the difficulty of cold cases. In the American justice system, particularly under Tennessee law, prosecutors must do more than create suspicion. They must overcome the threshold of reasonable doubt. A jury does not have to be 100% certain, but they must be convinced that no other logical explanation exists. If the defense can argue that the cause of death cannot be established, or that evidence linking the accused could be explained innocently, jurors may hesitate. In such a scenario, the risk is not only acquittal, but the permanent inability to try again, since double jeopardy prevents retrials once a verdict is reached. For investigators, this means that even if remains are discovered, the decision to prosecute will depend on the quality of the forensic record. They will need to weigh whether they have enough to present a coherent, undeniable narrative, or whether they risk losing everything by going to trial too soon. The haunting reality is that recovery alone does not guarantee resolution. In some cases, remains are found, identified, and laid to rest, but the perpetrators are never charged because the evidence cannot bridge the gap between suspicion and proof. Families gain closure of one kind while losing the possibility of legal justice. That risk hangs heavily over the Wells case. Still, discovery remains the most critical step forward. Without it, speculation will always outpace evidence, and the truth will remain mired in uncertainty. If Summer's body is ever located, the chances of prosecution will depend entirely on what has survived time, weather, and concealment. The best-case scenario is that enough forensic detail remains to speak for her when she cannot. The worst-case scenario is that silence continues, even in the face of physical recovery. In this sense, the stakes are higher than ever. Finding Summer would not automatically solve the case, but it would bring investigators to the threshold where resolution becomes possible. And in a story where every other lead has dissolved into uncertainty, that threshold may be the only path to justice left. When Summer Wells vanished, two agencies carried the primary weight of the search: the Hawkins County Sheriff's Office, responsible for the local ground response, and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, called in to provide expertise and broader resources. In addition, federal teams stood ready to lend support if evidence suggested interstate movement or organized crime. On paper, the response appeared strong, multiple layers of law enforcement converging on a single rural community. In practice, however, progress has remained elusive. Within hours of the initial report, officials activated an endangered child alert, quickly escalating to an amber alert as the scope of the disappearance became clear. Search teams poured into the Beech Creek Valley, assisted by helicopters, drones, K-9 units, and hundreds of volunteers. Interviews began immediately. Over time, investigators would conduct hundreds of conversations and log more than 6,500 leads. Each was documented, tracked, and followed to its conclusion. Lines of inquiry included sightings of a red Toyota Tacoma, strangers reported in the area, and the trail picked up briefly by dogs before disappearing near a roadway. Media appearances by Dawn and Candace, including one on the Dr. Phil program, were scrutinized by analysts who parsed their words, body language, and inconsistencies. And yet, despite the volume of activity, the investigation has not produced a single named suspect. Public statements from the sheriff's office and the TBI have consistently emphasized the lack of decisive evidence. Every trail has either ended in uncertainty or failed to meet the threshold for further action. For families and observers, that silence has been the most agonizing outcome: thousands of hours of effort, and yet no clear answers. Critics point to significant gaps. The sheer volume of leads may have overwhelmed local capacity, forcing investigators to prioritize quickly and sometimes incorrectly. Community pressure may have skewed the focus, directing attention toward parental involvement, while other possibilities faded into the background. And the absence of physical evidence has left even the strongest suspicions unsupported. Without a body, without a weapon, and without undeniable forensic markers, the case has remained balanced on conjecture rather than certainty. This stagnation has not gone unnoticed. Online communities, from Reddit forums to YouTube channels, have filled the vacuum with their own theories and investigations. Some participants attempt to reanalyze maps, weather reports, or photographs. Others focus on contradictions in interviews. At times, this collective effort has generated useful questions or highlighted details law enforcement seemed slow to address. At other times, it has fed rumor mills that cloud the truth further. Still, the intensity of public involvement reflects a deep frustration with official silence. The hope for many lies in change. Leadership in county law enforcement does not remain static forever. A new sheriff, with fresh priorities and a willingness to embrace modern methods, could transform the trajectory of the case. Where older approaches relied heavily on ground searches and traditional interviews, new leadership might employ data-driven strategies, aerial surveys with higher resolution sensors, satellite imagery comparisons over time, ground-penetrating radar in key sites, and heat mapping to identify areas overlooked in earlier searches. Advanced analytics could revisit the 6,500 leads, filtering them through artificial intelligence to find patterns human eyes missed. Geographic profiling could redefine the search radius, highlighting areas most consistent with known behaviors in similar cases. The larger truth is that this investigation has been marked by both enormous effort and deep frustration. It is a portrait of determination colliding with limitation, the limitations of evidence, of human resources, and of community patience. Without new direction, the Wells case risks sliding permanently into the category of cold cases, shelved, revisited only sporadically, and remembered as unsolved. But there remains one last possibility: that leadership renewal will not only reopen files, but reignite momentum. That the mistakes and oversights of the past can be corrected, and that the silence that has defined this case for years might finally be broken. As the investigation stands on the edge of uncertainty, the next phase may depend less on what was done in the first frantic days, and more on what a new generation of investigators chooses to do now. And that leads naturally to the final question. Can all the fragments, Candace's remark, Mary's allegations, Jodie Sue's suspicions, Don's chilling statement, the missing forensic trail, and the failures of the first search, be drawn together into a coherent map of truth? That is where the story now turns. Every story of a vanished child carries two layers: the mystery itself, and the reflection it forces upon society. Summer Wells' disappearance is not only about unanswered questions in one family or one county, it is about what communities, institutions, and individuals do, or fail to do, when a child's safety is fragile. The first lesson is about vigilance. Too often, warning signs flicker at the edges of daily life: arguments overheard, children seen wandering. Unusual patterns in a household, and they are brushed aside as private matters. But history shows that silence can become complicity. Communities must recognize that stepping forward with concerns is not meddling but safeguarding. One phone call, one tip, can change the direction of an investigation. The second lesson is about transparency. Institutions exist to protect, yet when agencies work behind closed doors, doubts multiply. Families deserve privacy, yes, but children deserve protection above all. When files vanish into bureaucracy or cases collapse without explanation, the public is left with mistrust. For the system to work, its guardians must balance confidentiality with accountability, offering clear communication about what was done, why, and what still lies ahead. The third lesson lies in resilience. Investigations falter, evidence erodes, and years pass. Yet cases once declared unsolvable have been cracked open decades later because communities refuse to forget. Forensic technology improves, digital footprints widen, and collective memory can be reignited by new eyes. Persistence is not just a virtue, it is often the difference between a child becoming a forgotten statistic or a name finally honored with truth. But lessons alone are not enough. Action must follow. If you live near the Beech Creek Valley, Revisit your memories of June 2021. Did you see a vehicle parked oddly, hear something out of place, notice a detail that seemed unimportant at the time? If you are part of the wider public, share her story responsibly, not through rumor, but through facts and careful discussion. If you work in law, child services, or media, use your platform to ask hard questions about how similar cases are handled in your community. This is not about assigning blame to fill silence. It is about preventing silence from swallowing accountability. Every child deserves to grow up without fear, and every disappearance demands the full weight of communal effort, regardless of time passed. The call is simple: if you know something, however small, take it to law enforcement. If you see a weakness in the system, speak it aloud. If you feel powerless, remember that awareness itself is power. It keeps pressure alive, ensures that a name does not fade, and maintains the urgency for change. Summer Wells' story should not drift into the long archive of unsolved tragedies. It should remain a spark that reminds society of its duty: to watch closely, to demand clarity, to act with persistence, to never let a child's absence be accepted as permanent silence. The final word belongs not to speculation, but to resolve, a commitment that one day the truth will surface, whether through new evidence, courageous testimony, or the relentless light of public attention. And when that day comes, it will not only bring answers for one child, but set a precedent that no child's story is ever allowed to vanish without a fight.